Welcome, everybody, to Special Education Thursday. We do these on behalf of Advocates for Justice and Education, which is the Parent Training and Information Center for Special Education for the District of Columbia. My name is Molly Whalen, and I am a longtime parent advocate in DC. For many of you who have joined me for Special Education Thursdays, we've now been doing them for a year. You also know that I have two children, now two teenagers with autism, and have worked with the public schools in DC as well as special education schools around my children. And we started Special Education Thursdays to take a bite-sized piece of an element of special education that we could maybe talk to an expert, and basically it's me as a parent asking kind of parent-oriented questions. So the session will last 30 minutes. We keep it really brief, but we try to keep it also down to parents or people who might not have any education background or special education background and ask those questions. My guest today is Dr. Lauren Lastromo, and she's a licensed psychologist and director of Ivy Mount's Multiple Learning Needs Program. And I've invited her today because she's a real expert in talking about when parents should think about exploring a certificate track for their student with a disability through school versus a high school diploma. And it can be a decision that's wrought with a lot of confusion, as well as not everybody kind of understands the pros and cons. It sounds like somebody just joined us. Please make sure you mute your phone. We are going to be recording, and let me try to do that as well. Okay, so Lauren, we always like to start, let me get back to the page. I always like to start by asking our guests, what's your background? Why did you get involved in special education, and kind of what are you doing now?
Great. Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I'm trained, my doctoral training was in the area of school psychology. So I really started, kind of working out primarily in the school setting as well as in, clinic type settings. I moved from the South to this area to complete my predoctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the Kennedy Krieger Institute through the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and I worked in the behavioral psychology department there, working across the pediatric developmental disabilities clinic as well as the neurobehavioral unit outpatient clinic, and through that really was able to work with a much wider variety of individuals with disabilities and their families and their schools. After leaving there, I was lucky enough to come on and join the Ivy Mount School, and have now been at the Ivy Mount School for about 5 years. So I've really loved working in a facility such as this, where we exclusively serve individuals with special education needs, and get to oversee their programming all day and work with their families.
And tell me, so we're going to jump right into this. So, and I've gotten one of your first slides up, but I really want to start with, can you just give us in the basic sense, what's the difference between a certificate and a diploma, and what does that really mean in relation to a student with a disability being in a school?
Right. As everybody's pretty familiar, diploma is kind of what we typically think. That's how you culminate your high school years. So the diploma has, certain course requirements. So students are expected to take a certain number of classes across certain areas, and they have to pass those. Additionally, for a lot of jurisdictions, there are testing or assessment requirements that go into that diploma. And then for some areas as well, there are, student service learning requirements. And that diploma, it's a qualification that's awarded to students when they exit high school if they've met those requirements. The diploma, is sometimes going to be a prerequisite to certain jobs or certain post-secondary education training opportunities. So, some colleges or community colleges would require a diploma or, a GED, the equivalency. Whereas, on the other hand, the certificate of completion really demonstrates that the student has, culminated their schooling, their special education schooling, and they have continued to participate in all their academic requirements, although they have not been required to pass to meet certain course requirements or certain testing requirements. So the certificate largely just means the student was able to participate in an educational program that was really more modified and tailored to their current performance level.
And then what does it, we're talking about, I know we'll talk about, how long a student with a disability can stay in a school setting, but when are the decisions usually made about like certificate track versus diploma track?
For some students who have more, a higher level of need in the area of cognition or, language in some situations, where there's a demonstrated, what they kind of refer to most often as a significant cognitive disability, we'll see students that may have that change made from a, kind of the standard diploma to a certificate program in, elementary or middle school. That does not happen in most cases. Most often, students are going to continue to be placed on a diploma program through their high school years. If they did not demonstrate that they had a significant cognitive disability through testing, essentially, and then within that high school period, then the IEP team is coming together to look at, even though, maybe based on their scores, this should be a viable option to obtain a diploma, we're still seeing the student have difficulty in his or her classes or difficulty of passing the required assessments or tests. And at that point, typically, the third year or so of high school is when we kind of see the next time period when many students will make that transition from a diploma program to a certificate program.
So kind of it's a high school. I've had parents say before, well, if we get this disability code or something else, in third grade, they're going to be on the certificate track. So it really parents should be thinking about that. This is more like a high school, for the most part, be thinking about it later in those high school years.
That's what we tend to see. We tend to see that really driven by the families, of course, but then also, that's, I think in most cases, that's what the local education agencies or the school districts, that's what they are pushing for as well. Let's see how long we can make this work for the student and see how far the student can go. And then in high school, you kind of have that bigger conversation, although you should be having conversations along the way much earlier than that about those topics.
I really want to highlight, too, the conversation is done with and in the IEP meeting. And it could be in between IEP meetings, but the IEP team is the parent, sometimes the student, it's the general ed teacher, the special ed teacher, sometimes a school leader like a principal or a director of the program, OT, speech, anything that student's getting. So it's that whole team that's making that decision, right? It's not somebody from afar making that decision.
Correct. Yes, it's the whole team's decision to make.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to flip around. I know and I do the slide. You've got this terrific slide about student learning variables. And I'd love for you to kind of explain what this is. And, because I think oftentimes when we think about these issues with the students, it's also like, well, how do you know? How do we know they can achieve it or not achieve it, or, maybe needing to focus on other things?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, like you've alluded to. And I think to kind of start off, I think it's so important to know, obviously I'm kind of on the school-based side, right? But I work with families, and Molly, you're coming from, from obviously the parent side. I think everybody in the room, it's clear that we can all kind of agree that we all want to see the child achieve as much as he or she can. So I think, sometimes it can be really difficult when the school-based team is sharing observations with a parent that may suggest, based on the evidence that we've seen, it may be difficult for this student to achieve a diploma. But I think it's really important for parents to know the school-based team is wanting the same long-term goals. They're really wanting to see the student learn as much as possible and learn the most meaningful things as possible. But they're really probably, if they're making those observations and sharing those observations, it's likely related to the things that are on this slide, so the student learning variables. Very often, in the IEP meetings, you'll have all the teachers kind of provide instructional levels. instructional level is just a fancy way of kind of saying, hey, this is really the sweet spot for where the student is currently performing. So, the student's instructional level in reading is a third grade level, although the student may be actually a fifth grader. That means, although the student is being provided fifth grade material, when the student is asked to perform independently, he or she is accurate and able to learn effectively at that third grade level. Beyond that, we kind of refer to it as a frustrational level. That's where the work is just a little bit too difficult for the student. And when work is too difficult, we would consider that to be kind of poorly matched to their level. The learning can slow down because they're constantly met with making errors, and that becomes really frustrating. Versus if we're teaching within that instructional level, the work is building on where they currently are performing, and so we're making more rapid progress. So we like to think about instructional match, and that just means how closely is the curriculum matching where the student is currently performing at his or her instructional level. So sometimes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I love that. Sometimes I stop on calls and say, hey, people, listen to this. But that instructional match to curriculum is one of the things that we often like to say, and I love to highlight to parents to remember that when you're looking at the IEP, if your child is in third grade or sixth grade, the reason a general ed teacher is frequently in the room for that IEP or should be in the IEP is because they should always be doing the curriculum of that grade level. And I think when it's this instructional match that you used, I don't think I've heard that term before, but just really connecting to what the curriculum has to be and where that instructional match, and your graph shows such a great place of like expected and then if actual, and you think about the frustration levels and the abilities, and school needs to be a learning experience and a rate of learning.
Absolutely. And then, rate of learning is definitely the other factor. I think, we take this kind of average across all learners, and that's then what we base, hey, okay, this is a third grade skill, this is a fourth grade skill, and so on. The sad thing is, and we know this, that's not everybody's speed. So while all of our students we want them to be learning at all times, we know, just like for us, we're going to learn things at different speeds. So while I might learn the same things that, another student can earn within a school year, it might take me 2 years. And that would refer to my rate of learning. So that graph is really showing, hey, across the general education curriculum and those general education expectations, students are supposed to be following that red line. But we know many students aren't. And so, again, we want to see that blue line continue to increase like it is, but as you can see, it might be increasing at a slower rate. And so what that tells us is it might be really difficult for that student to learn all the things that he or she needs to learn within the same time frame. And that has implications for how likely it is that the student might be able to achieve a diploma.
Mm-hmm. And so what are some of the kind of concerns and options that families and school staff are kind of talking about during this process? Like, at least let's say we're starting to see if everything's achieving and we keep going towards the diploma, it's kind of like best case scenario, even if it takes longer. But when we aren't seeing that, or we're getting the concerns, what are some of kind of the elements, like in real speak, that a parent might be hearing from teachers, if we're starting to think we might have to not do a diploma?
Right. I mean, I think you'll hear the teachers sharing with the parents that, Johnny is working really hard in class and he's doing his absolute best and he's making progress, but he's not making progress as quickly. And so we're having to make modifications to the curriculum. Most of our special education students are going to require what we refer to as accommodations, right? And those are just those different things that we do to kind of change the way that the student is able to engage with those requirements. So it doesn't change the expectation, it just changes how the content is presented, or how the student is answering or responding or showing that they've learned. Modifications are a little bit different. Modifications really do change the expectation. So if I know, again, that, Johnny is not going to be able to learn Algebra 1 content within the course of a year based on our extensive, history of his rate of learning, then I'm, as his teacher, would want to make modifications so that I can slow the pace of instruction down. And when I slow the pace of instruction down, that allows for Johnny to get increased practice, increased repetition of that same content so that he's really understanding it and learning it and then can use it and build on it. When we have to stick to the speed that maybe is best for most of the class but isn't best for Johnny, what happens is Johnny isn't learning the skills, and then so any new skill that builds on those prior skills, it's nearly impossible for Johnny to learn it. Versus if Johnny could participate in a class with modified instruction, which very often is the case in, our special education classes, then Johnny has enough time to really firm up the skills, and then he can build on those and make progress and meaningfully learn in his classes.
Mm-hmm. But if the modifications are so great, according to the local school districts, you're not going to be able to give the grade or credit because you could modify.
Exactly. And that's the other side. So you have.
Right. So you're kind of in a catch-22, and schools can say, well, we've modified it to the point where they can get it, but they're not going to be able to get the credit and therefore receive the diploma. So that's the point where, you're starting to, say, well, what are the other options, right?
Exactly. And I think that's such a challenging question, I think, for parents, obviously, but then teachers are weighing that question constantly. Do I keep full speed ahead and not provide those modifications so that Johnny has a chance to, maybe get the credit, even though I don't think it will happen because it's going to be too difficult? Or do I change the way I'm teaching so that I'm much more confident that Johnny is going to learn and he's going to learn meaningfully, but that might preclude him from earning credit in that class? And those are conversations that, teachers and parents need to be having all the time.
The reason why, instead of just saying, well, who cares, we're going to, modify it as much as possible and just keep pushing towards the diploma. I've got your slide up. There's some downsides of pursuing a diploma, without thinking of some of the problems that occur. So can you go over some of those downsides?
Absolutely. I think, one that I would just throw out immediately, because I think for parents and guardians, very often when students are younger and haven't quite hit that age where they're having to start to make, file applications for adult services and those sorts of agencies that will provide ongoing funding and support for students after they exit school, I think we automatically assume, well, of course, my child has autism, my child has an intellectual disability. Of course they'll get those services. If any parents are listening who've been through this transition process and application process, they know that's not necessarily true. While students are really entitled to services when they're school age, when they're adults, it's eligibility based. And so the adult service agencies have to determine that the student requires additional services. When students obtain a diploma, unfortunately, very often, the adult service agencies assume, well, then they don't need our help. They were able to get that diploma. And so that's something that I think we've had a lot of parents, kind of be surprised with. You think, oh, diploma means really great things, which it can and does, but then you don't expect that means, oh, wow, so all the help that my child still might need to maintain a job, maintain his household, all those sorts of things that he'll be required to do for the rest of his life, now it's less likely that he'll be able to get funding and additional services because of that diploma. So that's one consideration.
I want to highlight that definitely means, like, it's not an absolute, but it makes it that much harder for parents to kind of that reasoning around that. So it's just something that you have to be thinking about, what path are we going for with the student, like what comes next. And for many of you who are listening, we've done a couple of what comes next about secondary transition and those pieces. So this is the time that you have to kind of be thinking about the diploma. And one of the things you may get to it, but let me just jump in, that I always think is a big issue is that if you have to do so many modifications and extra reading support to get through the algebra pieces and history, you're also losing time in that school day where you could be doing a lot of other kind of maybe life skills or adaptive living instruction that would be exceptionally helpful for students who have a developmental disability or severe disabilities. So instead of focusing so much on maybe higher level chemistry, you're able to do a community-based instruction during the day or working on Metro, doing all those things. Do you agree with that?
I agree completely. Having to pass, as an example within the program that kind of I oversee, because those diploma requirements for high school age students are so rigorous and often, potentially not instructionally matched to where the students are performing, we provide double the amount of class time for English language arts and math classes. So that cuts down on the amount of time students can be, like Molly was saying, participating in the community and learning how to ride the Metro and, shop at the store and those sorts of things. It reduces the amount of time they're able to work at a job site and build those career or vocational skills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's those, I think that's what it's really hard is people think like, oh, well, we should always just go for the diploma. But I really appreciate you talking about some of these pieces that there are other things that we can fit into these very valuable high school years that make a lot of sense. I think another great example is instead of pursuing these very difficult, high school math credits, you could be doing everyday math kind of classes and utilizing money skills and different things. So it's just a balance and, for parents to be thinking about. I'm going to switch to the next slide, Lauren. I know I've said this to other people. We have so much that could talk about, but I want to make sure we get some of these highlights in our last 5 minutes. But what's the other thing I wanted to ask before you're done is like, can a student switch from one track another later in the school year? Like if they're on the certificate, can they go back to the high school or vice versa? And, or is that like so wrought with peril?
That's a great question, and we get asked that question a lot. Most often the question that we hear from parents is what you just said, Molly. It's, oh, well, if we move to a certificate, can we move back to a diploma? I think it's within the realm of possibility. However, I would say it's an incredibly rare occurrence. We tend to see students move in that other direction where they are moving from diploma to certificate much more frequently. So it's not out of the question, but it's much less likely to occur because we default to the diploma, right? All students start out on that pathway. Typically it takes, years of discussing and looking at results of assessments and talking about performance before the IEP team does commit to making that change from diploma to certificate. So the likelihood that something would change so drastically that would no longer be appropriate and a student should move from a certificate to diploma is incredibly unlikely.
It's definitely one of those things, parents, if you're listening, you really need to be thinking about it. Use your IEP team to talk about it, but just know that it's not we can keep going back and forth. So that it's not always final, but it's starts to get to a point where you just can't make a change, back to a high school, a diploma track. We skipped over it a little bit, and I know it's complicated in this area. We always like to make these Special Ed Thursdays a little DC focused. But talking about state assessments, which for DC is the PARC assessment, and alternative assessments, and that being also part of the diploma process and timelines. Can you talk a little bit about how that gets done on this kind of issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think DC's in kind of a nice position, I think, for students with special needs because although there's testing, the testing is not high stakes. So in DC, students currently are not required to pass the PARC assessments in order to achieve a diploma, and that's not true for all the jurisdictions. So although they would be required to participate in them and sit and take them, they don't have to meet a passing score in order to be eligible to earn that diploma. So that's a nice advantage, really. On the other side, the alternate assessments. So any student who's not pursuing a diploma, typically they would be taking the alternative assessments. And the alternative assessments are really going to be, they often are more portfolio based, it's more kind of individualized to the student, and it's not where a student, passes or fails. It's really more accountability for the school. So that's kind of one difference there.
A little less of I always think it's to describe it, an alternative assessment is less of like a test format and more of like the work that's done or, a work created or
Exactly.
Work. So that's something for DC parents to know. We've talked about the graduation credits on these special ed webinars before, and DC has a very, very stringent graduation requirements, like the credits, how many math, how many science, how many other pieces. But they are not requiring their students to show a passing grade on the PARCC assessments to get that diploma. So for students with disabilities, that means that they have to, the focus has really got to be on those class credits, still take the PARCC, but they just won't be, it won't be, if they fail the PARCC or don't do well in the PARCC, it doesn't really do them any harm in their pursuit of a diploma.
And one thing to just add to that, I would say parents and guardians try to stay abreast of that information because it does change. We see testing requirements, what test students are taking and whether or not they're high stakes and what are the remediation requirements. We see that changing often across jurisdictions. So just because currently they're not high stakes testing for DC, don't assume that would necessarily be that way in the future as well.
And Montgomery, just for parents who may be listening, Montgomery County does have high stakes testing, right? You have to do.
Correct. Yes, Maryland's testing is high stakes. Virginia also has high stakes testing.
Okay. I've got us on reflection slide. You want to tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, and this is just to kind of tie up everything that we've been speaking about. Again, I think as a school-based team and then as a parent, the parents and the guardians, the goal for the students and the children in our lives is for them to maximize their learning. So we want to think about, within this short window of time, what are the areas or what are the skills that are going to be most meaningful for them in helping them have, productive, self-actualized adult lives. And that's in terms of how much time is available as well as the content of what we're teaching. So is Algebra 2 more meaningful for the student or is community-based instruction, And you're really only thinking about that when the student is having a great deal of difficulty in Algebra 2. If a student's if it's easily passing the course requirements and easily passing the state testing requirements, that you're not having to really make that decision. The student should keep kind of, moving on that path. It's really for the students who are having a difficult time that you want to be kind of reflecting on those things. So number one, is my child meeting diploma requirements? If they are, great. You kind of continue as, you're currently moving. If they're not, you want to think about number two, which is, would my child at this point in their educational career meet the criteria to move to a certificate program? And that, again, will vary, based on the jurisdiction. There are score kind of variables that people are looking at. There's time requirements in terms of what age grade they're at that people are looking at. So if they do meet criteria to move to a certificate program, you could proceed to number three, which is where then you're really you have the really difficult decision of weighing the pros and cons of a diploma versus a certificate for your child. If the child doesn't meet criteria to move to a certificate program, typically the student is then going to have to remain on a diploma program. So there's not much that can be done at that point. However, that still needs to be a recurring conversation that's happening over the child's educational career, because things will change as he or she gets into their later high school years.
And I know you deal with a pretty significant population of students with significant disabilities, but in public schools and elsewhere, the students that are on certificate track should really be on the overall number of students in school a pretty small percentage. We're not talking a half of a school or half of students with IEPs. This really should be not that it's a numbers game, but it should be a smaller number, and it should really, really be the best decision for that individual student. And then, Lauren, I always like to end with What is two things that you wish all parents of students with disabilities knew about the issue of certificates and diplomas? What are just some two pieces or questions that you wish they would know?
That's a great question. I think the first one I kind of said earlier, but I think it's always hard to put into words how much the school-based team that's working with your child loves working with your child and wants the best as can possibly be achieved for your child. So please know that they're coming from that place, even when they have to have difficult conversations. But they respect that you are your child's best advocate, and they understand that sometimes you will agree and sometimes you will not agree, but you'll always get to a good endpoint. I think the second piece would be just understanding that because a student might move to a certificate, or just understanding about a certificate program, it does not mean that the bar is not still high for that child. It's just more individualized for that child. He or she will still be taught all the academic areas, and they'll get increased access to kind of the adaptive or the everyday life skills classes as well. But the teachers are still going to be challenging them and raising that bar whenever possible.
Mm-hmm. And is there any place that you would suggest to go if parents want to know more about certificates or that option? Any place that you tell them to go, websites or resources, or just go to your IEP team?
I think going to your IEP team is great, but then as there's a lot of good information online, and then there's always private kind of advocates and that the like of those folks that are available for more kind of individualized questions and answers.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much. As I promised you, the 30 minutes goes very fast. Thanks, everybody. The recording, if you joined us a little late and I saw a couple of people come in, the recording will be on the AJE website. It's aje-dc.org, and just click webinars and archived webinars, and you'll see all of our webinars from actually, we've been doing them since January. So we've got 1 year's worth of webinars on. And our next one will be February 8th, I believe, that Thursday. And we're going to be talking to DC's ombudsman for education and talking about kind of parents' rights and educational rights with that. But please visit the website because we've got a lot of different options. And Lauren, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you, Molly. Bye, everybody.